Welcome friends to another 40k video. Today we're going to take a look at the Raven Guard. We're going to look at their early origins during the Unification Wars and Terror. We're going to look about how they fight alongside the Lunar Wolves. And we're going to look at how they change when they are reunited with their Primarch, Corvus Corax. Now, the type of style of fighting that the Raven Guard employ is to watch their enemy from the shadows, to strike out, to then go back into the shadows, and to then attack again from a different angle, a different point of weakness, slowly bleeding the enemy dry. And it's this type of fighting that they employed when fighting for the Emperor during the Unification Wars. If one of the Emperor's emissaries was sent to a force that defied him, and they refused to comply with what he wanted, then the Raven Guard would be sent in there to take them out. The early recruitment into the Raven Guard was from the Xeric tribes of the Asiatic dust fields. They fought both amongst themselves and also with their enemies in the area. Once the tribes had been brought into compliance under the Thunder Warriors, they had to give up their firstborn sons to the Emperor's Gene Forgers. From there, they were made into full Legiones Astartes, and they made sure that the area that they had been raised in would continue to comply with what the Emperor wanted. Now, some of the culture of the Xeric tribes seeped into the Raven Guard. What this looked like was that they could be cruel to their enemies and be disdainful to those they considered weak. This was because the Xeric tribes had an attitude that a vanquished enemy, you must keep a cold, all-seeing eye on them, so that if they show any sign of fighting back against you, you will be able to defeat them. One of the earliest unification campaigns that involved the Raven Guard was the conquest of the Central Asiatic region. It was ruled by a tyrant dubbed Caligan of Ursh. Now, as with much things in the Unification Wars, we don't have a great deal of detail, but we know that the Raven Guard played their part in his defeat, and that how they fought there would give them an operational template that they would continue to use until being reunited with their Primarch. Once the weaknesses of the armies of Ursh were identified, the Raven Guard would settle themselves down into the region in small battle groups, taking up positions from which to strike. The attack, once put into action, was rapid, overwhelming, and conducted with cold, ruthless efficiency. The warlords of Caligan were struck down, and the defeated armies put into prison camps. We're told that the Caligans employed many manner of psychics, both psychics themselves and weapons in the style of psyches, and that the Raven Guard bore the brunt of these attacks. And we're told that some of the Raven Guard from that time were touched by certain darkness. The warriors in those fights might later go into suicidal charges or become the solitary forerunners of the Legion Moritats. But the Raven Guard overall were able to earn themselves many battle honours during the unification of Earth, when the Emperor's legions encountered Xenos presence, holding sway over many of the void settlements of the Jovian range. Raven Guard was tasked with scouring the moon of Lysithia, and we're told if records of previous battles are incomplete, those relating to this one are near non-existent. Whatever occurred on that tiny satellite, the Xenos were annihilated and victory claimed. But this came at the cost of a lot of the settlers' lives, as well as large losses for the Raven Guard themselves. And strangely, after this event, many of the veterans of the scouring of Lysithia were recalled from service by masters of the Emperor's Gene Forgers, and they were never returned to the Legion. What they carried out, how this done to them, nobody knows. But there was no similar instance of legionaries being withdrawn from service in such a manner. But for a long time, many that fought there wore a symbol of it upon their armour. It was the ancient Jovian rune. It was a reminder of the victory and loss on that day. And the symbol can still be seen now on Raven Guard dreadnoughts. Next, we're going to look at their ties and relationship with the Lunar Wolves. It would take around 2 centuries before the Raven Guard were united with their Primarch. The Lunar Wolves met with Horus much earlier, and Horus came to value the skills of the Raven Guard. So when the Lunar Wolves were deployed, the Raven Guard would already be in position, blocking off lines of retreat and cutting down any foe who attempted to escape. If you could break through those lines, you would be hunted down relentlessly. And so it became that Horus would often request that the Raven Guard be deployed under him with the Lunar Wolves, especially in the early days, perhaps before a reputation for what they could do was established Compliance was never that easy. Many times people would refuse the enlightenment of the Emperor. And so the twin forces of the Wolves and the Raven Guard would be deployed to, let's say, convince them. Horus treated the Raven Guard more like a chapter of his own legion than one with its own separate identity. And so at this point, the Raven Guard retained their Xeric tribal, savage approach and demeanour to things. There was an effect on the Raven Guard around this time, outside of the tribal markings they wore. Some found their skin growing unnaturally pale, and in a few, the dark hair turned as black as midnight, eyes turned entirely black, and so you can see them taking on some of the characteristics of their gene father. And so finally, Corvus Corax is united with the Raven Guard. They have found their lord once again. Once this happened, he instituted many of the tactics he had learned on the moon of Lycaeus, so that the Raven Guard were defined by melding stealth and guile with vigilance and swiftness. And it's around this time that the cold-blooded ways of the Xeric tribes, the origin point of the early Raven Guard, were purged. We're told that Corax actually saw amongst his guard some characteristics that reminded him of the slavers who had hurt the people he had freed on the moon. So some of the higher-ranking officers were reassigned to non-command roles or displaced entirely, including one man who had served for 3 decades, who was trying to make the Raven Guard his own. And we're told here about the skill of Corvus Corax, how he distilled down what he had learned and taught it to his guard. And there's a nice bit of trivia that Corax is even known to have bested Rubuti Gilliman in his brother Primarchs, notoriously testing Strategio Simulacra, making use of several unconventional troop types his brother Primarch had never before faced, including the forerunners of the Moritat. Corax only bested his brother 3 times in this manner, and once the master of the Ultramarines heeded the lesson and adjusted his tactics, the Raven Lord would never beat him again. So during the restructuring of the Legion, they were benefited by several innovations from the Forges of Mars. They were able to get a variant on the Thunderhawk gunship, dubbed the Shadow Hawk. Some of the technology employed in it would make it all but invisible to many augurs. The Legion also gained access to something called the Whisper Cutter, a very cool name. It was an open frame flyer constructed about a gravitic impeller and capable of dropping 10 legionaries into a war zone in utter silence and with practically no chance of detection. And you can see that this technology is very much in line with how the Raven Guard are going to be used. Now we're going to take a look at a specific battle that the Raven Guard took part in. It was known as the Battle of Gate 42. Now this conflict has echoes for the Raven Guard's later losses during the Istvan job site massacre. Horus has brought a cluster to compliance, but those there have since cast off the shackles of what the emperors wanted to place on them. It's because they have been taken over by Xenos parasites, these rather disgusting creatures, mature within the eye sockets of their hosts, and as they grow and mature, eventually the host and the Xenos form a Gestalt mind, and it's under this that rebellion happens. They are dubbed the Unsighted Kings, and so Horus brings together several legions under his command in order to prove to his brothers that he was the right choice for War Master. He brings together elements of the Lunar Wolves, the Space Wolves, the Iron Warriors, and the Raven Guard. After bringing some of the Outer Worlds into compliance under his heel, the War Master calls together a conference, a council for some of his brother Primarchs. One part of his plan calls for the Raven Guard to make a frontal assault directly into the guns of the defenders of Gate 42. Corax argues that this is a waste of resources, and he proposes another idea, that his legion should draw off enemy forces in a series of feints, allowing the 3 other legions to overwhelm what defenders remain at the walls with comparative ease. Perturabo accuses him of being a coward essentially, that he seeks to avoid battle. They nearly come to blows, and Leman-Russ steps in and speaks to Corax and convinces him to go with the idea of his brother, of the War Master, he who the Emperor has given command over all the others to. So going into the fight, Corax assigns many of his Terran-dominated companies to the van, in particular those whose captains appeared the most willing to play their part in the War Master's plan. And so the fight began. The assault companies were decimated, and they were almost about to falter, when Corax himself led the Legion forward in a forlorn hope. He got them to put in such efforts that the breach was carried and Gate 42 taken. The honour of actually slaying the Unsighted Kings was given to Horus, and after he had done it, the Xenos hold over the population was gone, and the War Master was able to reclaim the prize he had lost. The Raven Guard suffered deep casualties, as did the humans on the planet. So although it was counted as a victory, the losses the Raven Guard suffered afterwards made it the smallest of the Legiones Astartes, and Corax swore never to work or to fight under the banner of the War Master again. And one last consequence of the Battle of Gate 42 lingers still. In its aftermath, those line officers who before the coming of the Primarch had served for so long under Horus's command were gone, and with their elimination, the lodges that had got into so many of the other legions, they were not part of the Raven Guard, as those that might put them in place were gone. Those who served under Horus before Corax appeared were not able to organise the lodges, which would lead to issues for many of the legions who did have them later. And so, without that, Corax was able to consolidate his power and pave the way for a future more in line with his own vision. As a result, the Legion was largely spared the wave of insurrection that was transmitted through so many of the legions by the hidden auspices of the lodges. However, they did suffer a horrific number of casualties later on Isfahan 5. And that, friends, is where I'll end today's video about the origins of the Raven Guards and the influence of their Primarch Corvus Corax on them.